Well, thank you for including me again in today's program. It's good to be back with many of you virtually, and I do welcome your questions. Let me start by saying a little more about AGC. We operate through a network of 89 chapters nationally. They span every state from Alaska to South Florida and include Puerto Rico, from Maine to Southern California, and out to Hawaii. So I hope that you're either a member or involved with the chapters. Collectively, we have over 27,000 companies that belong to AGC. About 6,500 of them are general contractors, and the rest are divided between specialty contracting firms and providers of equipment, goods, and services, such as those Brown Edwards provides. And what I want to talk about today is first, what's been going on with the employment situation, second, spending by project type, and then third, and top of mind for many construction firms, materials costs and supply chain glitches. And then I'll wrap up with some forecasts for where we expect the industry to head next. Let me start by showing you what's happened to construction employment since the pre-pandemic peak in February of 2020. These are the figures the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out on the first Friday of each month. And they actually report on 5 segments of the construction industry. I've combined these into 2. The blue line shows a combination of home builders and general contractors who specialize in multifamily housing, plus specialty trade contractors, whether they're working on new homes or additions and renovations to existing housing. The red line takes the non-residential building contractors, specialty trade contractors, and heavy and civil engineering firms. And putting these together, you see very similar decline at the beginning of the pandemic. From February to April 2020, both segments of construction declined at about the same rate as that green line, total non-farm payroll employment, down 14 to 16%. In the case of construction, that was a loss of 1.1 million jobs in just 2 months, about half as many as the industry lost in the entire 5-year period from 2006 to 2011. Well, construction bounced back much faster than the overall economy as stop work orders were ended and people who had been cooped up at home went out to buy or remodel homes. And then contractors were very quick to make use of Paycheck Protection Program loans that enabled them to bring back workers who had been furloughed. But after June of 2020, we saw a big divergence between residential employment, which kept climbing at a steady pace until by the end of the year it had surpassed that February mark, and it kept growing almost every month this year. But non-residential construction employment basically stalled until just the last 2 months, when it did have hefty growth in September and October, but the recovery rate is still well below that of total non-farm payroll employment. Well, there are big differences by state. Tomorrow we'll get the October figures, but from February to September of 2021, U.S. employment and construction was down more than 2.5%, and only 14 states were above their February 2020 level. 35 states were below and 1 was level. We also do a survey at AGC, and we were fortunate to get over 2,100 responses to our annual workforce survey that we released on September 2nd. About 1/3 of the firms said that they had to reduce employment over the previous 12 months. But nearly 3/4 of the firms said that they expect to add to their headcount in the next 12 months. It's not going to be easy, though. 90% of the firms had an open craft position if they were hiring craft workers at all. We do have members who operate entirely through hiring subs to do the work. 62% of the firms said that they had openings for salaried positions. We asked about 21 specific crafts, and 89% of the firms said that they had difficulty filling one or another craft position. In fact, for every one of those 21 crafts, at least 70% of the firms said it was difficult to Perhaps even more surprising on the salaried side, overall, it was just about as hard to fill salaried positions. We asked about 11 of those, and the hardest to fill were project managers and supervisors and estimators. Why? We gave them several possible reasons, but overwhelmingly, the number one reason was that the available candidates, assuming they even had a candidate, didn't meet their requirements, either didn't have the right training or experience, or they had some blemish on their employment record that disqualified them from that particular job. Not surprisingly, with such difficulty filling positions, 61% of the firms said that a project had been delayed because of a shortage of workers, either their own or a subcontractor's workers. Now, even more firms said that a project had been delayed because of shortage of materials or delay in shipment of materials. But nevertheless, there's a very high percentage saying delays due to shortage of workers. Where are we headed from here? Unfortunately, I think things may get even worse for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's an ongoing survey of Facebook users. Admittedly, that's not a scientific sample, but it is a very large sample, and it's been going for a long time with consistent results. The latest figures covering the last week of October showed that only 53% of the respondents who identified themselves as construction workers said they had been vaccinated, compared to 81% of workers in other occupations. And conversely, 40% of the construction workers said that they were hesitant about getting vaccinated. That was more than double the share for other occupations. So the implication is that construction firms are going to have a harder time fielding full healthy workforces, and the difficulties will be compounded if we do get those OSHA rules, or the federal government and other employers require that, other project owners require that anybody on their premises be vaccinated. Even apart from the difficulties caused by COVID, is the fact that the premium, as I call it, for construction pay has eroded over time. As part of the monthly employment report, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports on what they call average hourly earnings across an entire industry. And they do this for all workers and also for production and non-supervisory employees. That would basically be the people out in the field and some office workers, hourly workers for construction firms. Historically, as you can see on the blue line here, construction has paid anywhere from 18 to 23%, really 20 to 23% more than other industries overall. But since the pandemic, that premium has dropped to less than 18%. And for all workers, it's dropped from a 9 to 12% premium down to less than 8%. If you've seen the signs in fast food store windows saying $15, $16 an hour to start, I've heard about warehousing, delivery companies offering similar starting pay plus bonuses to sign on or to stay, and perks that may make those jobs much more attractive relative to construction, which generally has not been raising pay at a faster rate than in the past. So I do think it's going to be hard to get entry-level workers and maybe to retain some workers. Let me stop here and find out what you think is the major reason construction is having trouble filling jobs.
Alrighty, I'm launching the poll, and if it doesn't pop up for you, you may have a pop-up blocker on. If that's the case, just submit a question to us and we will use that as your attendance. Alrighty, I'm closing the poll now, so get your responses in. All right, Ken, I've shared the results.
Okay, Holly, I'm not seeing that on my screen. Can you tell us what those results are?
Yes, so the winner at 42% was young workers don't have right skills, training, or attitudes. Second place was working conditions in other sectors are more attractive at 25%, and 21% was wages are no longer competitive, and other was about 12%.
All right, well, I think all of those reasons are true. It's one thing I didn't mention is how jobs in other sectors may have become remote, allow more flexibility on hours as well as the working location. And so construction really has a challenge. It's not possible to restructure many of those on-site construction jobs. And in today's economic climate, I think that will continue to be a challenge for construction firms. Well, let me move on to what's happening with construction spending. This is a series the Census Bureau puts up on the first business day of each month. They get information from a large sample of construction firms on how much expense they incurred in a given month. So this series differs from what you may see from Dodge Data and Analytics or Construct Connect. They're privately collecting information on projects, and they put the total value of a project into the database the month they deem it to have started, and then it disappears the next month. So their series is quite volatile, whereas this one shows the progression of spending throughout a project underway. They're both valid ways of looking at construction. They have different uses. But I think the key thing here is first, if you're comparing the first 9 months of this year to the first 9 months of 2020, total construction spending was up 7%. That sounds pretty good, but there are two things to keep in mind. First, these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. We don't have a single inflation adjustment or deflator for housing and hotels and highways and all the other types of construction. You can't use square footage or linear feet or any other single unit. Second, and more important, is the huge difference between residential, whether it's single family, multifamily, or I didn't squeeze it in here, those additions and renovations to owner-occupied housing. They've all been up by strong double-digit percentages. On the other side, both private and public non-residential spending are down about 6% year to date. The rest of this table shows the change in different categories, and they're listed in descending order of 2021 size. Within the categories, you see parentheses, and the subcategories also listed in descending order. But some of these definitions are fairly quirky. Starting with power, it does cover every form of power generation, transmission, and local distribution, but then census adds in the spending around oil and gas wells and pipelines. And there's been a big drop in that oil and gas side. The electric side is just about level, but I think it's going to pick up in a big way. We're seeing the beginnings of massive offshore wind projects off the East Coast, more wind and solar onshore projects coming, and those are going to require transmission lines and also huge utility scale storage, typically battery storage, but there may also be some pumped storage, such as what we have around Lake Anna in Virginia. The second biggest category, education. Last year, primary and secondary school construction actually picked up for a few months. Once the schools closed, contractors went in and upgraded HVAC systems, put in physical barriers, and built temporary classrooms outside the main building. But now that that work is finished off, you can see that the 2021 totals are down. However, I think that will start to turn around because so much of the new housing is being built at the fringes of metro areas or outside of metro areas where there isn't enough school capacity if those families stay put and put their kids into local schools. On the other hand, higher ed down very steeply, and I don't expect any improvement in the near future because while US students have mostly come back to college, it's not, enrollments are not near where they were. And most important, foreign students until recently were really having trouble getting visas. Many of them still are, but even if they do, they may not want to take a chance on being marooned here, as many of them were in March of 2020, or not being allowed back into their own countries. Many of those were full-pay students, and without them, not only are colleges and universities deprived of important revenue, but they have less need to build new dorms, classrooms, and other facilities. Highway and street construction is one of those categories that is certainly going to benefit from the final passage this week of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that President Biden signed on Monday. This puts $55 billion over the next 5 years into highways and bridges on top of what was already in the renewal of the so-called FAST Act. Now, the infrastructure bill also puts a total of $1.2 trillion across many categories, but it's the highway money that I think will come out the fastest, because it is going through established mechanisms, Federal Highway Department, state DOTs. Many of them are ready to start awarding contracts in the near future. Commercial is a term that gets used in a lot of different ways, and for census, it means warehouse, retail, and farm construction. And not surprisingly, warehouse is one of the strongest growing categories here, and retail is one of the most depressed. Retail has actually come back a little bit, but I think that's mainly because we're seeing a lot of spending on restaurants. They're adding so-called streeteries or outdoor dining spaces, and new restaurants are replacing ones that closed. But the rest of retail, I don't expect to see improving anytime soon. In fact, just this morning, CVS announced that it was going to close 900 stores because of changing buying patterns and population. And so I do think that this is a sign of how depressed retail is likely to be. Now, office looks pretty bad, but in fact, it's much worse. There are two reasons. First, these non-residential categories include renovation as well as new construction. And sure, there's plenty of office remodeling going on. But the second reason is that these categories were set up 60 years ago or longer, and within the office category is data centers. I think of an office as a place where people work, or they used to anyway, not where just electrons run around. But at any rate, data centers are in here, and to my eternal frustration, we don't get data on them. They're not broken out. But if you could break out the fast-growing data center market and the active office renovation market, the figure for new office construction would be a good deal worse than -9%. On the other hand, manufacturing, which was down by double digits, has come back just about level, and you can see the biggest subcategory is all positive. The largest, chemical, that includes pharmaceuticals, and we're getting a lot of new plants and lines to produce medicines and vaccines. Transportation equipment, it seems every day another startup company is making headlines on the plans to build light trucks or cars or even heavy trucks that are electric powered, and doing it in either a new plant or a retooled one. And then food processors are adding lines to produce more in the quantities and sizes and cuts that individuals or grocery stores want, not just restaurants and institutions. The electronic, electric, and computer category is about to turn around in a big way, because last month Intel broke ground on what they say will be a $20 billion campus in Glendale, Arizona. They're also building near Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, also has plans for multi-billion-dollar expansion. Transportation is a mix of modes and of public and private. And like highways and schools, last year contractors were able to accelerate work in many airports once those annoying passengers and planes got out of the way. But with that work finished up, now the airport authorities are saying, where is everybody? Why would we need to add gates in such a hurry? So I do think the airport construction will be depressed for a while. But one of the things that will be a major category for new spending is passenger rail, particularly Amtrak, but also support for some freight rail and other kinds of commuter rail. So I think that the rail category is going to pick up. The trucking industry is going to be adding truck terminals to relieve some of the congestion. So that one should also turn positive. Healthcare, almost flat. We've seen some swings back and forth, but I think the trend favors construction outside of hospital settings and more for specialized care facilities such as standalone urgent care or outpatient surgical center, and also procedures in doctors' offices and medical office buildings. Now, lodging doesn't even fit on this list, that there should be several other categories before you get down to the small lodging one, but I squeezed it in just to show how dramatic that drop-off has been. And this has continued to get worse month after month. So while we've just started to allow foreign visitors into the country, I think it'll be quite a while before we see a pickup in hotel construction. Let me move on to costs. This slide shows an index that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out in the middle of each month called the Producer Price Index for inputs to construction industries. It puts together all of the materials and services such as wholesalers and steel service centers, trucking services that every kind of construction firm buys. And from being at a low point in April and May of 2020, this index has soared. It's up 28% over the last 18 months, even after having a decline in the last couple of months. In contrast, the bid price index, the formal name is the Producer Price Index for new non-residential building construction, was dead flat last year. It started climbing for several months this year, and then it really shot up in October. This means that contractors are starting to catch up with these huge price increases that they were caught with, but there's still a big gap between the red and blue lines, and that represents the pain that contractors are experiencing on costs exceeding what they've bid. In fact, this shows how many items have been going up in price. Steel mill products have more than doubled in cost over the last, or at the producer level in the last 18 months. Copper and brass mill shapes up by 2/3, aluminum and plastic products up by more than 1/3, gypsum products up by almost 1/4. Now, one that I skipped over, lumber and plywood, did have a very long, steep decline for several months, but in the latest month, it turned up again. And if you look back to the September to November 2020 period, you see an equally steep downturn, but it quickly reversed and the prices set new records for the first 5 months of 2021. I don't think we'll get back to record levels, but this does show how volatile any of these prices can be and how long a drop it would take to get back to that early pandemic low. How long will this pain last? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I have a rear view mirror. And this shows what I'm seeing when I look back to the beginning of this series. The red periods are when contractors were hemorrhaging profits because the year-over-year change in materials cost was exceeding the year-over-year change in bid prices, specifically for warehouse construction, because that's the one for which we have the longest time series. We had 28 months in which that gap occurred from late 2009 to the beginning of 2012, and again from late 2016 to late 2018 for nearly 24 months. It hasn't lasted that long yet, but the peak is more than twice as high as ever before, meaning the pain is that more intense. Well, let me find out what you think is the biggest challenge for contractors at this point. Is it finding and retaining qualified workers? Is it absorbing or passing on these materials costs? Is it coping with supply chain delays and outright unavailability of certain materials and components of construction projects, or something else?
All right, the attendance poll is open. I'll leave it open for a little bit. and let me know if you have any issues with submitting your poll. If so, submit a question. Okay, I'm closing the poll now. Okay, Ken, the winner on this one at 48% was finding and retaining qualified workers. Second place at 33% was coping with delays and availability for products. At 19% was absorbing or passing on material costs, and other received no votes.
Okay, well, I think that matches what I'm hearing. I would say if we had asked this a few months ago, materials cost probably would have been number one, but people have gotten used to it or maybe numb to it, and they're more concerned about the delays and whether when they open that truck, there'll be enough or the right quantity of what they had ordered. So I do think that this is going to be a persistent problem. We keep hearing how the supply chain bottlenecks just are not getting cured, whether it's the CEO of Intel announcing that he thinks it'll be 2023 before the semiconductor chip shortage ends, or the count of ships that are backed up off the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles is hovering around 80 ships, and it takes up to 2 weeks before they can even unload, and then the containers sit on the dock, or they get brought to a warehouse that's already full, so they sit on the chassis as a mobile warehouse. These things are going to take quite a while to fix. Well, let me say that AGC feels your pain, that we're not able to unload those containers or build a steel mill for you, but we do try to keep owners, officials, and others informed about what's going on through the Construction Inflation Alert. This is an 8-page document that discusses these situations and somewhat what can be done about it. One of the things that we think can be done is price adjustment clauses. We, along with 40 other associations, sponsor Consensus Docs, a suite of construction documents that includes a model price adjustment clause that if an owner agrees, they will get some of the benefit of price decreases for an item like lumber or steel or diesel fuel in exchange for taking on the risk of unexpected price increases. And presumably the contractor will reduce their contingency if they know that the pain is going to be shared, as well as the rewards. We also know that some contractors are buying materials earlier, getting the owners to front the purchase, or at least get more specific about what quantities and specs will be needed so that they aren't caught short at the time that they're going to put those into place. There's no perfect solution, though, that requires storage and insurance and risk of loss or change of design. We've done a number of webinars to help educate people about what's happening and what their choices are. And we've been lobbying the federal government to get rid of those damaging tariffs that are just throwing fuel on the flames of price increases. 2 weeks ago, President Bush and the EU trade minister announced that they would suspend tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from the EU. And today there's a meeting of the US, Canada, and Mexico that we hope will bring some progress on getting rid of, or at least limiting the tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. And discussions also happening this week with Japan. But we're a long way from seeing those harmful tariffs abolished. I said I don't have a crystal ball, but I do look at some others. For instance, the Architecture Billings Index, produced each month by the American Institute of Architects. They asked several hundred architecture firms, were your billings higher or lower than the month before? And when the number of firms saying billings went up exceeded the ones saying billings went down, that index is set above 50. Well, yesterday morning, AIA released the Billings index for October, and for the 9th straight month, that value was above 50, whereas for all of the months of 2020, it was below 50. They say this indicates that the value of construction put in place for new non-residential buildings will increase 9 to 12 months later. So we're at that threshold. Similarly, Dodge looks at projects in the initial planning stage, and they create a sub-index for commercial and one for institutional buildings. All year long, their index has been running well above where it was in the previous year. And they say this indicates spending on those project types 12 months out. So another favorable indication for non-residential building. Then the Census Bureau puts out figures each month on single and multifamily starts, permits, and permits that have not yet turned into starts. Now, developers don't always start up a multifamily project the month they pull the permit. They may wait until a high-rise building is leased up to a certain extent, or a garden apartment complex has one building done before they go on to the next. Nevertheless, this backlog, which as of October was up to 110,000 units, about 50% more than a year ago, very favorable indicator for continuing the strong growth of multifamily spending in the near future. Let's see where you think non-residential construction spending is headed. Specifically, when do you think it will get back to pre-pandemic levels? Already there in next year, or in 2023, 2024 or later, or never?
Okay, the poll is open. Okay, I'm closing the poll now. Okay, Ken, the winner at 39% was 2024 or later. The second runner-up was 2022 at 14%. Already there was 13%, and 9% put down never.
Okay, nobody for 2023?
25% for 2023.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'm a little more optimistic, but there's an asterisk on that. As I said, the construction spending figures are not adjusted for inflation. So to the extent that you think that inflation is showing up in the final price of projects, then chances are you pick an earlier date than if you're doing one of those real measures like square footage. At any rate, I do think that the economy is going to keep growing at a good pace. We had a slowdown in the third quarter that was driven partly by supply shortages, notably for automobiles, but also by the COVID, the Delta variant, causing some businesses to defer bringing people back to the office, slow down on things like spending on entertainment facilities at sports and other amusement and restaurants. Hopefully we won't see a repeat of that. But even as the economy grows, I do see some concerns about construction. First, as I mentioned, that low worker vaccination rate is going to make it hard for construction firms to assemble full healthy crews or to have workers qualified to get onto some job sites. But also we are seeing many owners that had suffered a big revenue loss, big question about whether they need to expand facilities, whether a business for its own account, a landlord that lost a lot of rent, an institution like a university, or a government agency such as an airport authority. So for all of those reasons, the rebound for construction is going to be slower than for other sectors. And then you also have these continuing cost and supply challenges that if an owner learns that that facility that it planned on having open by a certain date and at a certain budget is not going to hit either the budget or the opening date target, they may say, well, we'll wait until things calm down. Haven't seen much of that yet, but as I showed you, those bid prices did take a big jump just in October, and to the extent that that causes sticker shock for owners that they hadn't experienced, we may see more delay. Now, the infrastructure bill, as I mentioned, huge amount of money, $1.2 trillion, supposedly over 5 years. The reality is a lot of that is going to take much longer to spend out. Some of it may never be spent. But compared to a non-residential construction that's running about $700 to $800 billion per year now, it's certainly going to be a big boost. And some of it will hit soon, such as the highways, beginning on some other things, but others will take a long time, as it will take creation of new mechanisms to decide how to even apply for funds and then how to award them, and then for the contractors to be chosen and to go out and buy the materials and assemble the crews and start work. For the longer term, I think we're in for slower population growth. We've certainly seen that in the last few years, and the figures that have come out just this morning's paper saying that we had 100,000 excess deaths, or 100,000 deaths from drug overdoses last year, as well as having several 100,000 deaths from COVID, mean that the death rate has gone up, the birth rate has been severely depressed, immigration is far down. So this means really minimal population growth in the last year. We'll rebound to some degree, but for the longer term, we're certainly going to see slower growth in new housing, in streets and underground utilities to serve it, and the schools and public service buildings that go along with it, and also in local government revenue to pay for that. The shift from retail to e-commerce is permanent. It's going to continue evolving. We're seeing more so-called last mile or last hour facilities close to residences. Some of them are newly built, others are conversions of big box or anchor stores in malls, and some are hybrid. For instance, there's a grocery store near me that closed a couple of years ago. It has reopened as an Amazon Fresh store, and when I went in there, I saw that while they still have aisles and freezer cases, they also have a big section for pickup or delivery. So it's essentially a hybrid distribution and retail facility. We're also getting e-commerce facilities for cold storage, cold delivery of foods and medicines, and huge facilities for distribution close to airports. The facilities themselves are also evolving, going higher as you get multi-level truck bays or more automation inside, allowing higher floor clearances and more automated delivery, drones and robots, that being fewer trucks needed and smaller footprint. More specialized and online healthcare facilities, the energy market evolving in all its stages, more renewable facilities, more transmission lines needed, massive storage, and also tens of thousands of battery charging stations. And all of that will require new kinds of manufacturing facilities for the equipment and materials that go into those. Let me close by showing you a map of where population change is occurring. As I said, we had a big slowdown. Last year, population grew just 0.35%. That was less than half the rate of 5 years before. And 16 states, a record number, were in deep red, meaning they lost population. Most notably, California lost population for the first time in the 120-year history of this series, probably the first time since it became a state in 1850. And that has helped fuel the population increase in those Intermountain West states just to the east of it. In addition, we're seeing continued elevated population growth in Texas, in some of the southeast states, in Washington, and interestingly, one mid-Atlantic state, Delaware, as more people retire from the DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia areas and move to the beaches and near beach areas of Sussex County in southern Delaware. Well, that's the story. I'll stick to it until I get new data. When I do, I'll put it in the Data Digest. It's my weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction. Be glad to add you to the email list. Just email me at ken.simonson@agc.org. And I'll also send along our latest construction inflation alert and a set of these slides. So I think we have a few minutes left for questions, Billy, if you have gotten any, and maybe Holly, you want to remind people how to pose questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please, there's a question chat box below that I have for Ken. Ken, I just have a question. You're, obviously it's a challenging time when you talk about workforce and backlog and supply chains and increasing cost. It certainly seems that there's a lot of headwinds ahead. Were these similar indicators that we saw prior to the 2008 recession that we all experienced? Were there similar market metrics at work during that time, would you say?
There's some similarities from that end of the brief recession in 2000. We saw a steady pickup first in housing that really helped make that recession shorter and shallower, and then a couple of years later, non-residential construction, both public and private, kicked in. So there was intense pressure to find workers in the middle of that decade, and also some shortages of materials. We'd really let manufacturing capacity dwindle, and so we were hearing of steep increases in steel, allocations for gypsum, even cement was in short supply because we had a very wrong-headed tariff on Mexican cement that eventually we got rid of. But so those things are somewhat similar, but I'd say it's unprecedented this time, both in terms of the price increases hitting so many materials again and again, no notice on many of the steel price increases, shortened notice on other price increases, or certainly lumber just went wild. And so it's really been extreme pressure on contractors and even more on subcontractors that are only buying particularly vulnerable materials. And then on the labor side, you do have this challenge that the competitiveness of construction seems to be eroding, both because the wage premium has diminished and the working conditions that people are looking for they're being satisfied by other industries, but construction is really stuck with having people on site, out in the weather, and in some cases working close together, which is a concern for people who may have so-called long-haul COVID, have folks at home who haven't been vaccinated or immunocompromised. So all of these things make it, I think, a longer-term challenge for the industry.
What is the, obviously, I think discussing inflation a little bit and kind of the underlying causes of it, certainly the supply chain demands and challenges that are out there are going to continue. But do you anticipate that being made worse by the infrastructure spending? I guess, there's a lot of government money feeding into our economy. I've heard a number of economists say that has somewhat driven our inflation, and was their opinions. But I would welcome your thoughts on that, and also the thought of whether or not the infrastructure could potentially make inflation worse versus better.
Yeah. Well, I admit I underestimated how high inflation would go, or how long we'd be stuck with it at this point. But I do think that we are going to get back to flatter prices. I won't say price declines, but we already saw that in some of those price indexes I showed, that the steep increase that occurred for a year or longer has tapered off, flattened out, had some at least short-term decreases. And economists like to say the cure for high prices is high prices. And that's happening here, that we're seeing gradual increases in production capacity. We're seeing some buyers, some owners say, well, let's wait until prices flatten. And that is weakening that momentum for price increases. The supply chain kinks are going to take longer to fix, I think. And so that will make difficulties for completing some projects. As for the infrastructure bill, it's really too early to say how soon that money is going to be awarded for most kinds of projects. So my guess is it won't be affecting demand for construction materials or labor in the next year, and that will give a needed breathing room for adjustment on both the materials availability and labor availability. And then remember that this infrastructure spending is going to make this country more competitive and more productive. And so while there will be pressure on the construction industry, the completion of those facilities, whether it's highways or better protection against catastrophic flooding or improved water systems and broadband, all of these things should help make the economy run more smoothly. And that in itself will help tamp down inflation.
Understand. We do have one question here from the audience, and thank you for your commentary on that. Your slide said it was unclear whether office space would rebound or decline, and also heard on the news that people were moving back into the cities from retreating during COVID. Any comments on or additional data on either of those two topics specifically?
Yeah, I do see figures showing some movement back to cities, but I also know that so many employers who had planned to open in September sometime in the fall have put it off to early next year or made it indefinite or adopted greater flexibility than they had expected to. I think many of them thought, okay, after COVID dies down, then we'll go back to business as before. But they're finding that employees who have been able to work out of the office for over a year, they don't ever want to go back on a full-time basis and maybe not go back at all. I'll confess I'm in that category, that I had never worked at home because I thought I can't be as productive as I am at the office. Well, in fact, I find that the flexibility and the hour saved of not commuting and the ability to get my lunch right away instead of going out of the building and waiting until it's fixed, those things really do make up for some of the time that maybe I would have been more focused at the office. And so I'm happy working from home. So I think that those things are all working against a return to offices and to related businesses. I feel for those lunch places that I used to patronize and the dry cleaning or other services that people at offices drop in on during the day. So we're a long way from seeing how this shakes out ultimately. Now the kids.
Go ahead, no, please.
No, I was going to say that now that people can get their kids vaccinated, maybe they're less worried about being back in closer proximity to other people. So I think cities will rebound somewhat, particularly as the entertainment and other kinds of options open up again, and maybe people who for a while enjoyed the rural life say, you know, there was a reason that I chose earlier to be in a city, but it really is too early to know for sure what the mix is going to be.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I find that the discussion of work from home, which our organization has adopted as well from a flexibility standpoint, but in construction, obviously, most of the work has to be done on site. And I wonder if that's just another competitive disadvantage the construction industry has if they can get a job working at home or on a computer. It's just one more barrier for getting people in the construction industry. So certainly a challenge there. I will put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you one question. If there was one piece of advice that you would leave for contractors as they read the tea leaves over the next couple of years, where would you tell them to be focused?
Well, I do think that new energy markets are going to be very powerful for quite a long time, and there are a lot of ways of playing that. Obviously, most construction firms aren't in a position to go out and build a wind farm or a solar field or put up giant transmission lines or big storage facilities, but also battery charging will be a big deal. Manufacturing, and it isn't necessarily giant wind turbines, but many kinds of components and parts are going to be needed. So there will be niche markets in manufacturing. So in terms of growth areas, that certainly looks like one, along with continuing growth in warehouse and data centers. But I think the thing I hear most often from contractors about how to cope with this environment is just make sure that your communication channels are very open and active. That as soon as you hear from a supplier that something is going to be late or maybe not available at all, make sure that you're communicating that with the owner and discuss at the beginning of a project, even before design is final, are there alternatives that might be cheaper, might be available more readily? Or is there some way that you can flex that project, pivot if you do run into some unexpected snag? So I guess those are the two things I'd talk about.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't think we have any other questions. Ken, we sincerely appreciate your time and can't thank you enough as always, and appreciate your time, and hope you have a great day.